I appreciate everybody joining into this panel today and our panelists for this very important discussion. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about energy consumption and environmental sustainability of blockchain, specifically Bitcoin, especially over the last few months. And I think this is a very important discussion to really kickstart the understanding of how scaling really affects sustainability. And you know, with that, I really want to ask Steve Shatters here to introduce himself. One of the things that he demoed just recently was the Terra node, and you know, I'm very curious. You know, we're very familiar with your background, but I'm very curious about how sustainability or how scaling helps with sustainability.
Yeah, well. The topic of sustainability, I suppose, is a question of the balance between the cost of something and the benefit that it provides. And the fundamental unit of utility and benefit in Bitcoin, I guess, is the transaction. So there's a lot of talk about the energy cost of Bitcoin per transaction. When you increase the transaction rate by a factor of 50,000 without actually increasing the energy consumption of the entire network, you've essentially dropped the per transaction cost by that same factor. And you know, 50,000 is just the starting point. We're talking about millions, billions of transactions per second. So, you know, it's only one angle to it, but there's this total aggregate energy cost for Bitcoin, which you can divide amongst 5 transactions per second, or you can divide that cost amongst millions or billions. Yeah.
Great answer. I definitely think to see, you know, as scaling comes on board with Terra node, you know, that the energy efficiency discussion here will start to really make an impact across the other blockchains that are, you know, that are available out there. You know, as the block rewards shrink, you know, what effect would that have on the overall hash rate and power consumption on the BSV protocol?
Yeah, so there's some interesting dynamics there because as block rewards diminish or even before they diminish and transaction fees start to take over, it does actually have an impact in a couple of ways. At first, the number of transactions, of course, is driving down the per transaction cost. But Bitcoin has built into it a fundamental incentive for miners to be able to reduce their costs. And of course, one of their major costs is energy. That allows them to offer cheaper transaction fees, and if they do, then that puts all the other miners on the spot to reduce their transaction fees as well, which of course means they have to drive down their costs, and that means finding more efficient ways of making use of energy. Mm-hmm.
How would that differ for, say, BTC?
They don't actually have an incentive to increase their capacity or to drive down their node costs, because at 5 or even 7 transactions per second, like you can run that on a Raspberry Pi. So they'll never actually drop their per transaction cost without the BTC price itself dropping, because there's this pretty much one-to-one relationship between price and hash rate, which is also related to the amount of energy that's fed into the mining ecosystem. But that's not going to be true. Well, sorry, that's actually not strictly true that hash rate is a function of price. It's actually a function of revenue. And when they rely entirely on block rewards, then revenue just kind of stays static. It becomes a proxy for price. So I don't really see a pathway where incentives will sort of competitiveness will sort of drive energy costs in one direction or the other with BTC. It's purely a function of price. Yeah.
Okay, and one of the talking tracks about proof of work is, you know, that it is a dirty energy or you know, power hungry consumption-wise. And, you know, I'm curious, there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, Ethereum moving towards a proof of stake. How does that, is that a better solution, do you think?
Proof of stake has one sort of critical flaw in this argument, which is that it's fundamentally broken and doesn't work. The only way to actually make proof of stake start to work is to combine it with proof of work. Broken in the sense that, or the key difference, I suppose, between proof of stake and proof of work is that miners actually have to continually outlay operational expenditure and put it at risk. So that is actually what drives them to compete in order to get their blocks propagated quickly, in order to get their infrastructure up to scratch, etc. But it's also what drives them to compete on cost, which is making their operational inputs to their business as efficient as possible. And of course, there's nothing more efficient or the world is moving toward the direction where there's nothing more efficient in terms of energy supply than renewable. That's something that we absolutely can and should be doing, is just transferring, converting Bitcoin energy inputs from non-renewable to renewable resources, and the market exists, or the market forces exist to do that in the same way that they do with any other industry that consumes energy.
Well, we heard a little bit about, the island state of Tuvalu, and it's interesting to consider that use case. So, how would you say that BSV integrating into, a nation would help with sustainability as well as help fight the effects of climate change?
Well, let me count the ways. First things first, Tuvalu is a small nation. It probably wouldn't even end up running a Bitcoin node or whatnot. They don't need to because of the SPV model. Bitcoin is a user and service sort of oriented architecture, and there's two peer-to-peer networks that exist there. But the utility that the blockchain itself can provide is itself, a benefit. Tuvalu would be a fantastic candidate for lots of localized solar power generators, etc. And imagine a world where appliances are talking directly to this solar array or that solar array, and negotiating deals to get the power from the source, the localized source that it can most efficiently deliver it. So.
Interesting. Well, I appreciate that. And, Zach, you've got a very interesting background with Unbounded Capital. Could you just share with us kind of your role there and your role in the energy discussion?
Sure. Well, I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Unbounded Capital, and we invest into the Bitcoin SV ecosystem. And definitely the topic of, is Bitcoin eco-friendly, has been one that our existing investors and prospective investors have been asking us a lot lately.
Oh, great. So, interestingly enough, this discussion was kicked off by Elon Musk. At least revisited by Elon Musk recently.
Yeah.
So, what did he get right and what did he get wrong about, what he said?
Well, before Elon, I want to pick up where Steve left off, which is, and what really got the conversation started, at least within the investing community, was Stone Ridge's annual shareholder letter they released in January. And there they make some good points, and I think the main thing is that proof of work mining really incentivizes just having the price of energy being as cheap as possible, rather than having the price of energy be as cheap as possible when keeping in mind the distribution of that energy, as the Bitcoin can absorb all of that hash power. So what we're seeing is that as renewable energy becomes more efficient, it's getting foreshadowed within Bitcoin miners, where Bitcoin miners use renewable energy at a much higher rate than any other type of miners today. And we think that's going to continue as a result of them not having to connect to a centralized grid to take advantage of that power. So we definitely recommend people check out the Stone Ridge annual letter for kind of the investor perspective and to dive more into that. But Elon really got the conversation started, where we had some conversations then, and then I think almost every investor since Elon got expressed his, I think, legitimate concerns with the environmental costs of BTC Bitcoin. It's just been a big topic of conversation, a topic of learning, and since then we actually even started writing a book on the topic of, is Bitcoin an eco-friendly technology? And we're definitely referencing Elon Musk and Tesla within that book. And I think what he got right is that BTC Bitcoin is not efficient, and it does not I think, have a good ratio of what it costs to use and the environmental cost relative to its utility. I think what people get wrong, though, is then that's true for all proof-of-work blockchains, that's true for all versions of Bitcoin, that's true for crypto in general, as we clearly see something different within BSV Bitcoin. And specifically, you were using the figure 50,000. It, I guess oscillates where between 10,000 and 100,000 times as cheap, as efficient as BTC Bitcoin, depending on the time of day today. But it's more comparable to Visa. So today, from our preliminary analysis and working on this book, we're seeing that it's about half a cent to process a transaction on the Visa network, and it's slightly more than half a cent on BSV. Where that, I think, is truly remarkable, as this is kind of the beginning of Bitcoin, where Visa has already achieved like an incredible amount of efficiency as best you can within that type of transaction processing network. So I think we're excited to see kind of the proliferation of Bitcoin becoming more and more efficient. And so in that sense, Elon, I think, was right in his looking at BTC Bitcoin the way that he is, but I think I would encourage him, instead of trying to get the Dogecoin development community to raise the block size by 10x, he should look at the most efficient and scaled blockchain today.
So, during this ESG, or environmental sustainability and governance discussion, what do you think is the biggest misconception about it?
Well, there's a lot of big misconceptions, so it's hard to give one. But off the top of my head, I'd say we're seeing that BTC is synonymous with Bitcoin, which I think everyone watching this here knows isn't the case, but is still definitely, I'd say, a major misconception within kind of the broader investment world, as well as the fact that proof-of-work mining is inherently inefficient. I mean, this is kind of the misunderstanding that is the basis for a lot of the crypto and blockchain world that we see today. Why people think that we need to do things like proof of stake because, say, BTC or Ethereum are inefficient, and those are kind of the two networks that are synonymous within the broader community with proof of work. But really, proof of work without a limit on scale is actually wildly efficient, and perhaps one of the most efficient technologies ever created in history.
And it's interesting that you bring up the efficiencies, because when you really start to look at, Visa, as you mentioned, that's just one company of a financial payment system. But when you really say, that BSV in the future could potentially compete with Visa, right, as even with a carbon footprint per transaction, when you really think about the whole ecosystem of that's just one small company in the payment system. So if we're saying that BSV could compete with just Visa, then obviously there's a lot of room there for improvement as far as a global payment system. And when you start tying in some of the other benefits of, say, BSV into what could happen to an enterprise, you start to see that there are these other variables that, Steve and yourself have kind of brought up, as far as, there's the cybersecurity aspect, there's the legacy hardware aspect, there's, all of these little additional cost to process these transactions, where on blockchain, obviously, you can mitigate some of those cybersecurity concerns and mitigate some of those costs, legacy costs. Going back to that, is how much more efficiency does that provide for any type of company, and how would they kind of look at the power consumption that they're using now versus how they could utilize BSV to lower that power consumption?
Well, I think Steve said it best at the beginning, which is you can't just look at the power consumption in isolation. You have to look at what is the utility, what is this thing providing, and then how much power does that cost, and looking kind of at the net metric, not just on how much power, which I don't think is which I think is a pretty horrible metric for analyzing this. So yeah, I think payments is an easy to understand example, and while BSV is certainly not taking any of Visa's major customers today, it is competitive. You're looking at basically a very similar per transaction cost for Visa and Bitcoin SV. So I think what we just need to see is more value-add services on top of Bitcoin, because really what Visa does very well is not just processing transactions very efficiently. It's having a whole end-to-end solution for processing payments. And I'm excited to see kind of what the entrepreneurs are doing in the space today to make Bitcoin more competitive with Visa directly. But you're right, that really is just a small, I think, drop in the bucket in terms of what Bitcoin's potential is. And there's many ways to kind of unlock the efficiency of Bitcoin. In addition to payments, I think something we're really excited about is whenever data needs to be read and accessed by many different companies or many different people, especially across the world. I think that's a great example of where using Bitcoin today provides significant efficiency compared to some of the non-blockchain solutions that exist today. And yeah, efficiency is really synonymous with its environmental cost, as there's a very strong correlation between the environmental cost of something and the efficiency. If that's too out of whack, then entrepreneurs will come in and take advantage of that opportunity.
Absolutely. Fascinating. I appreciate your input on that. Moving over to Angela, I appreciate you joining us today, Angela. We've spoken a lot over the last few weeks. As TAO is a publicly listed company on the Canadian Stock Exchange, with your headquarters in Toronto, an infrastructure and blockchain transaction processor and service provider to the many applications to the Bitcoin SV ecosystem. Tell us a little bit more about TAO's operation.
Hi, Brian. Yes, and thank you. So TAO delivers blockchain processing power to enterprise clients that are building on the Bitcoin SV network. We actually own and operate ASIC miners that are hosted within Canada. We are ahead of our annual projections for installation, and so we should see 450 petahash online by the end of this month. And we've just announced that we have another 4,000 machines coming online by the end of this year, and going into Q1 of the new year. That puts our operations at about 15 megawatts of power by the end of the year. And all that hash power is directed to secure and supply the Bitcoin SV blockchain. So right now we're estimating on current network conditions about 30 blocks a day. So all of that hash power and processing power is going to support our transaction processing business line. So helping provide those solutions for enterprise to easily and efficiently transact on the Bitcoin SV and validate their transactions to the blockchain.
So when you're, as TAO's really made an effort to kind of host a lot of their machines in Canada. So, exactly, if you could share with me, how does that play into your renewable energy strategy?
Yes, we chose Canada because it has a strong regulatory landscape, great climate for mining, but it also has an abundant access to renewable and clean energy. Canada is the world's third largest hydroelectricity producer, and coast to coast there are major utility providers that we have access to. A popular location for mining in Canada is Quebec, and a major utility provider is Hydro-Quebec. They recently reported at the beginning of this year that they provide electricity to over 100 mining operations, and that continues to grow. There's definite interest and growth that's coming into Canada for mining operations. Another popular location is Alberta, which has been traditionally and historically known for oil and gas, but they are making significant growth in renewable energy, mostly solar and wind. And it is also reported that they are projected to lead the nation in renewable energy. Speaking of Alberta, we have recently announced that we went into partnership with Hut 8. It is another publicly listed company in Canada and a mining operator. They operate on a mix of power, so that is renewable and natural gas. And we chose them as a partner as part of our ESG strategies and a vision for environmental and sustainability, because they share in some of that. They have strong operating strategies, corporate culture, and they're really investing a lot in a carbon neutrality approaches. And in Alberta, of course, as we see more invested into these renewable programs, we're going to benefit from that. And as I said, we have more machines coming online. And so our strategy is going to be looking for partners that share the same vision in making an impact and using environmental and renewable sources.
So you brought up ESG, which is, obviously a hot topic of, the last few months as well. What are some of TAL's, positions on implementing an ESG program for the company?
Yeah, so just to echo kind of what Zach was saying is we recognize the growing demand of investors and shareholders that are interested in this topic. And we are going to continue on focusing, building out our strategic goals and our corporate culture around these policies, and we're exploring several areas, including our supply chains in ways that we can improve. We're going to continue to invest our attention on partners that also share the same vision. And we do a lot internally in terms of research and development and education and awareness to invest in our corporate culture and then find ways that we can make an impact in our supply chain and ways that we can join associations and groups that are focused in this area.
Fascinating. As we kind of we're talking about ESG, I want to welcome Kirsten Harrison to the floor here. She's got an incredible background. If you don't mind, would you share a little bit about your background, Kirsten?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. Hi, and I'm delighted to be on the panel. My background is very much in environment and sustainability. So I have a master's degree in environmental technology. I've been involved in the sector for 20 years, and certainly for the last 3 or 4 of those, what I have mainly been doing is net zero strategies across a number of different sectors. So I work for Zumo, which is a decentralized finance platform, and I'm building a net zero strategy for them. So hence my particular interest in crypto. I have to say it's one of the more interesting fields that I work in at the moment. But probably I'm a slight anomaly here because I have one foot in the crypto sector and one foot out. And so I think probably my addition is more of a broad overview in the context of our global aspiration to move towards net zero rather than the kind of technical expertise that the rest of the panel have in the crypto sector.
So what advice would you give for startups or companies within the BSV ecosystem to start to begin to implement an ESG program for their offering or application or even company?
First off, I would say the most important thing is to have the right mindset for it. We need to believe that we can do this. We need to believe that we're part of the solution. We need to have some grit and determination. And once we have that, we're actually halfway there. Within the crypto sector, we really need to see this for the opportunity that it is, because within crypto, technologically at least, we're in a really great position to move rapidly towards net zero. I understand, of course, that it's not as easy as that in practice, but technologically we're streets ahead of a lot of other sectors. Aviation, for example, has huge challenges ahead of it in terms of decarbonising. So that mindset is definitely the first thing that everybody needs to have straight. The second thing I would say is sign up to the Crypto Climate Accord. For those of you who may not yet be familiar with it, the Accord was launched in April. It's a private sector-led initiative within the crypto sector that aims to fully decarbonise the sector. And so Zumo is one of the early signatories to that. And over the next months and years, there'll be a lot of tools and advice and support coming out of that from both its signatories and the Accord itself that will really support people on this journey. But it's probably worth me just adding a few thoughts on our own experience at Zumo, because we're probably slightly further ahead on this journey than many others in the sector. So at Zumo, we're in the process of developing our own net zero strategy. We started by committing to be climate neutral in our own emissions, which means everything in our supply chain. It means all our staff working from home, commuting, business travel. So we're looking at it with a very wide remit. In climate terms, we're looking at our scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, for those of you that those terms might be familiar to. So we've started with our own emissions, not because they are the most significant, but because we need to do that to get everybody within Zumo behind us, to show our intent and really to take us on the journey that we're now on. And where we're at now is to look at the carbon footprint of the blockchains that we're working with. So this is the interesting bit. Now, we're looking at this from both a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. We see bottom-up as being the mining community, where really the biggest impact is, but also the biggest changes that can potentially be made to drive improvement. And a top-down approach, which we see as being our platform and our users. So the decisions in terms of blockchains that we work with, which includes BSV now, and ways that our users can offset their emissions associated with crypto holdings. So I think that kind of that's the framework that we're following, and we believe it's a really good framework for others to follow. We will be providing more information on our journey later in the year. We believe in being open and honest about this. We want to provide information on our findings, what we've found difficult, and what's helped us along the way, so that it can support other people too.
Great. Publicly, proof of work is claimed to be just a waste of energy, right? So as an environmental expert, what is your perspective on that?
That's an interesting one. I think, you've got to look at this in the context of net zero strategies from my perspective. And normally working on net zero strategies, absolutely the first thing that we need to do is look at reducing energy consumption as much as we possibly can. So for me, this is put a really interesting dynamic on working in the crypto sector, because with proof of work, we can. The energy use is inherent in the network. It's there to add the security and validation that the network's there to provide. So the reduction in energy in general is not necessarily something that we can address. So the decarbonisation needs to be driven in different ways. And as I said, luckily as a sector, we're really, really well positioned to be able to do that. But I do have some thoughts as to why proof of work is perceived the way that it may be externally by some not in the sector that don't fully understand it. And, I think proof of work is very, very much equated to BTC. And I think what happens then is that people see this direct line between electricity use, Bitcoin, the value that Bitcoin creates, and that sits directly with the holder of that Bitcoin. So in terms of benefit to society, I think that it has been difficult for the general public and those not involved in the crypto sector or with a particular interest in crypto to see what the wider benefits are. And I think that's really where BSV comes in, because even if electricity use does increase, to the same extent that it has on Bitcoin, the utility that will provide will be evident to everybody. So everybody will benefit if the electricity use for BSV increases along those lines. So I think we need to understand why there is a public perception as it is, and be respectful of that. I think in general, I think people perhaps might have good reason to believe that proof of work is a waste of energy, or perhaps something that we need to make more efficient, and that's a fundamentally kind of misunderstood version of what proof of work is. And I think we probably have quite a lot of work to do in the sector to communicate that ourselves, and to show the benefits that BSV can bring to society, and therefore how beneficial proof of work is.
Absolutely. I'd like to transition back over to Steve here. Projecting into the future, as you see transaction processing, how do you think that plays out, as the subsidy disappears, and as, where do you think the hash rate, and how do you think the energy consumption argument plays out as time goes on?
I think the long-term trend is down. I think you're actually going to see a curve where the energy sort of goes down, comes up again, and then starts to trail off. And that's because Bitcoin hasn't reached an equilibrium of transaction volume yet. There's an equilibrium point, all going well, where everybody's using it every day. 8 billion people, IoT devices are all using it, and we kind of achieve a saturation point. Until we get to that point, transaction volume and probably revenue is going to grow, and that will push hash rate up. once we've reached that equilibrium, that's where the slow slide starts, because the competitive factors of Bitcoin start to kick in, and miners will be looking for more efficient ways of doing everything because they're competing with each other. But I'd like to extend on the point that Kirsten made, which is it's explaining how integral proof of work is to the utility of Bitcoin that is probably going to be our challenge. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find people who would say, who would argue that it is bad to use energy to run a hospital or to run agriculture and produce crops. I don't think it's very difficult for us to construct or to make the argument that the utility of Bitcoin is in the same ballpark. I think the problem that people have with proof of work is that they don't understand that it is actually integral to Bitcoin. Why can't we, provide that utility without using proof of work? Why shouldn't we use proof of stake? I mean, we talked about that, why we can't before. Well, why can't we run a hospital without using energy? There's another way to do it. Well, we could, but we'd be doing operations in the dark. We wouldn't be able to use hospital instruments because we wouldn't be able to manufacture them. We wouldn't be able to use pharmaceuticals to treat patients. And the proof of work is sort of integral, like it goes hand in hand with the utility that Bitcoin can provide. So we need to make the argument about the utility, and that's where BTC falls down, because no one actually sees any utility there. They just see a ton of money being thrown around for no comprehensible reason. But the connection between that utility and proof of work is a challenge, I think, for us in explaining why Bitcoin can actually provide, huge benefits to society at large at a cost that is justifiable.
So I'd like to ask each of you, the same question here is, as ESG is obviously a very hot topic, would you say that, and across every industry and vertical, would you say that Bitcoin is better suited to, deal with the ESG problem and environmental sustainability?
I would, because it has built into it fundamentally an incentive to drive the efficiency of the system drive the efficiency up and the costs down. Yeah, Zach's comparison with Visa. I mean, we've got equivalent utility and probably orders of magnitude more utility than a system like that already with a similar cost. But we have the prospect of that cost just coming down and down over time.
Yeah, I mean, the title of our webinar on this topic was, is Bitcoin one of the most eco-friendly technologies? And we argued yes there. We're going to expand on this argument in our book upcoming, but I think there's a meaningful chance that when we look back 20, 30 years in the future back to now, or over the next 5 to 10 years, and I think there's a very good chance that Bitcoin adoption is synonymous with our transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and potentially the largest driver of that revolution.
Angela.
Yes, I think that we're still in the early stages, and we believe that there's going to be a dramatic impact in a good way to the power consumption as the chain and the transaction throughput continues to grow and scale and replace legacy and soon redundant systems. The energy sector is also, what we're seeing, is quickly adapting to this demand and producing great avenues for renewable energy and access to that.
And Kirsten?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to give you a bit of information about some recent research on the traditional finance sector, which I think is really relevant to this point. To me, there's a very direct line of sight between Bitcoin energy consumption and the holder of that Bitcoin, which has led people to be very concerned about energy consumption of Bitcoin. But to me, in the future, that direct line of sight might be a very, very useful thing to us, and I'll tell you why. In the last 3 months, there's been 2 very credible reports produced on the traditional finance sector, looking specifically at financed emissions. Now, what I mean by that is when you put money in your bank account, your savings account, your pension, what that money is indirectly funding through loans, etc., when it's in there. So these 2 reports have separately looked at the financed emissions of the finance sector. And one of them, by a global carbon disclosure program, CDP, has estimated those financed emissions to be 700 times greater than any direct emissions that the finance sector is currently responsible for. That would include any offices, servers, anything like that. And the other one was specific to the UK, but is still very relevant here. It was conducted by WWF and Greenpeace. And it looked only at the biggest financial institutions in the UK. And even then, the financed carbon emissions of those institutions is double that of the net emissions of the UK. So the figures are fairly staggering. Now, to me, we are only beginning to unpick this. With net zero strategies, it's not credible only to look at direct emissions. We need to look at supply chain emissions and financed emissions too, which is really what's coming to light with the traditional finance sector. And within crypto, I think that this direct line of sight between electricity consumption and the utility of, for example, BSV will actually become very useful for us, because we don't have a tangled web of emissions to unpick and extrapolate. We can actually develop some really good metrics around it. So I do see it long term, at least, as an opportunity.
You know, you bring up a great point about metrics, and it speaks to, you know, the larger climate discussion that's occurred over years, right? And it comes down to the data that, you know, people or scientists such as yourself utilize to, you know, hammer down that point. And, you know, Angela, I think as a representative of TAL, a major transaction processor, you know, what interesting ways could you see in the future with TAL to, you know, maybe put some of this data on chain to where it could be, you know, verified and used later on?
Yes. So with application development and transaction generation and that data going on chain, what we're going to see in the future is a single source of truth. And the data will be there. It'll be there will be no silos, and it'll be easily accessible to industries and institutions that need that information. And it'll just be more efficient, and it will be indexed appropriately. It will be accessible, and it will remove some of that redundancy that we see with siloed industry data.
Great. Do you foresee TAL possibly in the future, you know, publicizing any of their metrics that they, you know, as far as the consumption of what it would take to, you know, process a block or even a transaction?
Yes, of course. We will be working on those numbers and producing those shortly.
Awesome. And lastly, Steve, you know, as far as, you know, you look at the entire energy consumption across, you know, cryptocurrency and specifically, you know, proof of work blockchains, how do you think the best way is to, you know, kick off this argument or discussion, you know, as far as with real metrics and a real model and, you know, really taking a look at the data that comes from the transaction processors?
How to kick off that discussion? Well, of course, have the data to begin with. That's a good beginning. And the Bitcoin network kind of lends itself to that sort of data collection because it's sort of got this two-layered hierarchical structure in that you've got lots and lots of miners that all connect to one pool and then lots and lots of pools. So you've got these sort of logical data collection points. I guess how you kick off that discussion depends on who the audience is. If you are talking to investors in a mining operation or something like that, then they're going to be interested in different things. But I think we also want to paint a picture of the future. You know, the proof of work argument or explanation that we were talking about before, but also the way that the dynamics of the system is going to change over time. We also want to identify and articulate how Bitcoin actually can contribute to energy efficiency, not just in Bitcoin itself, but you know, across the entire economy. And there are plenty of opportunities there. We haven't really been able to touch on those today in the time that we had, but that is, fine material to start a discussion around.
Yeah, well, that's great. I really think that this is the beginning of this discussion, and over the course of the rest of this year, I think it'll continue to be a topic that is explored on various avenues, whether the technical avenue or the investment avenue or the scientific avenue or even the processor avenue. And I appreciate all your guys' time today, and thank you very much for joining us remotely and here in studio.